I recently posted a comparison of several different membership plugins, particularly for the WordPress platform. And as I did it, I picked the top 8 that I consider to be significantly of value and ease of use and high performing in such a way that you may have different needs and requirements, but most of your requirements would be filled by one of these 8. And I even highlighted which one I thought was the first one you ought to take a look at. But they're all, the comparative study is there. It was done. But I got some emails today that were asking why other plugins weren't in the list. All right. I mentioned either in the posts or in the video that I looked at over 22 different membership plugins that I'd evaluated. And yet here I was describing only 8 of them. And so some really big names, some common names that you hear a lot in the membership world were not there. In fact, someone wrote, I think in one of the comments of the post, that most of these were new that they hadn't heard of. And in fact, all they'd been hearing was about some others. So I thought I would specifically address the question, right? Why wasn't Wishlist Member, Digital Access Pass, aMember, why weren't these S2MemberPro? Why weren't they in the list? After all, they've been around the longest. If you do searches for membership plugins, often you'll find them, right? Now, here's something to understand about that, right? You find them on Google. That's not Google necessarily voting for them as the best. It simply states they've had the longest time on the internet to have other people write posts about them, right? So if you wrote a plugin 5 years ago, you've had 5 years to accumulate traffic and backlinks, etc., and that will move you up the charts. On the other hand, if you've only been around for a year or 2, you're going to have a lot less backlinks. It's not going to put you as fast up the charts as something that's been around for a long time. And it doesn't mean that because something's been around a long time that it's bad. You don't want to get into that mode of the shiny new thing is the one that's worth looking at. But there's a couple things people don't know, right? Or don't always take into account. And the first is that WordPress itself as a platform shifted dramatically a couple years ago, now probably 3, when WordPress 3.0 was released. Now we're at 3.9, getting ready to hit 4.0. So that's a lot of versions ago. But when WordPress 3.0 came out, we introduced a new structure, which was called custom post types. It was a new way to capture and store data that was similar to posts and yet outside of the post realm. And why is that important? Well, if you look at all of the membership plugins that have come out since then, what you'll notice, a majority of them, if not all of them, take advantage of the new infrastructure. And because of that, they get some benefit. They get some performance benefit. They get an ability to, in the visual display, interact differently than those folks who came long before, right? If you came, and you can imagine, if you built a plugin 5-6 years ago, before 3.0 came out, before custom post types was around, you'd be in a place where you would have done everything on your own. And you can imagine how hard it is to think about rewriting your entire infrastructure to now leverage this new thing. And in fact, most older plugins haven't done that at all. Now, just to be clear, I mentioned aMember or aMember. aMember is not even a WordPress plugin, right? It was one of the most popular approaches back when WordPress didn't have a lot. And so you'd use this other program and then you'd integrate them. The challenge, of course, with integrating them was you'd actually have to write some code, or you'd have to borrow other people's code to connect it up to the user database that WordPress has, because the two didn't know each other. These days, all of the membership plugins that I listed out all take full advantage of everything that's in WordPress, including all the members, right? All the users, all their roles and rights, etc. So that gives it a tighter coupling and a better end user experience because of it. But on top of that, right, we talked about if you're an older product and you haven't migrated to the newer stuff, then it's likely that you've kept your older infrastructure. Now, that's not necessarily bad either. But the thing to understand about that is sometimes an older architecture presents performance challenges in the long run. This is the case, for example, with Wishlist Member. It's not a bad plugin, though for the longest time, it wasn't fully GPL compliant, which meant that a bunch of the people who are close and in the core part of the WordPress community didn't really pursue it very often because it wasn't fully GPL compliant. More importantly, some of the code was masked, which meant you had to only use what was available via the API. So if you showed up to me and said, hey, I bought a license for Wishlist Member, and then you wanted me to do something, there were certain things I couldn't do. And I had to wait for the API to show up to be able to do certain things. Now, over the course of years, that API has gotten much better. And in fact, I think it's become now fully GPL compliant, but that's recent. But the thing to understand about that older architecture is it can result in performance problems. And we've used it directly, and I've been a long time inside member or whatever the program is that monthly allows me to get access to more plugins and add-ons and reinforce all sorts of things that you can do with Wishlist Member. And it's really fully featured, but it's a little more complicated to get your arms around. The API is only recently getting fully there, so developers have a harder time or had a harder time interacting. And from a performance perspective, we noticed challenges. Even as few as 100 concurrent members that were trying to interact with the system would require you to use a much more complicated infrastructure in terms of your hosting, right? So you would have to get more and more hosting infrastructure to support the fact that the plugin struggled a bit in performance. In fact, one managed host, I think it was ZippyKit at the time, now Pressable, actually had to ban the use of the plugin on their infrastructure because the performance problems and the support issues that they were dealing with. But there's still a couple of others, right? S2MemberPro has tons of features, and it's true. Just about anything that you could want to do with any of the 8 plugins that I recommend, you can do with S2MemberPro. It's not a problem. The challenge is that it takes 2 to 3 times as long. Now, if you've already bought it and you've already used it, there's no reason to change because it does a lot of great things. Unfortunately, if you're just getting started, you might spend weeks or months getting everything configured. If you just visit the page itself, the website for S2MemberPro, S2Member and MemberPro, you'll discover just tons and tons and tons of features, which is awesome. Except if you have to click on every one of those tabs, if you have to step through every one of those settings to configure it. And here's the bigger challenge. The bigger challenge is that most people don't actually understand what all those options do. And they can end up creating conflict between option 1 and option 16B, right? And without knowing what that impact is, and without an ability to do the impact analysis, and without becoming a membership expert, it can get really laborious. Right? So you see, and you can do a search, or you can find tons of people who have decided to move on because you can get some of the same things done with the newer plugins simply because they have abstracted some of that complexity and made it easier for you to get started. Right? These days, if you want to add someone to a mailing list as they buy the membership, it's a checkbox as opposed to going through several different tabs and different features to go click through to make sure something like that happens. And that can be a problem. And then lastly, we have digital access pass, right? One of the things that those guys are really good at is they continue to add more and more features. They continue to update the product. That's great. It is an older infrastructure. They keep updating it though, but that update also creates new challenges, right? What you really want is a product that stays stable so that you don't have to relearn something every time. And one of the things that we've had challenges with, me and my team, as we've worked through looking at and working with Digital Access Pass, was that, every 6 months to 12 months, they introduce a new way to think about something, including memberships and recurring charges and other things like that. And then you have to go back and rework things. And again, part of that dynamic is if you have an older infrastructure and you're updating it, you're going to then have to go back and change how something's done, which means for end users, you're going to have to go back and adjust your site and adjust the infrastructure. And that's not fun. So there's nothing wrong with these plugins. Many of them are older and are consistently improving, which is good news, but they do possess or present a harder time for end users than many of the ones that are out there today. And feature for feature, you'll discover that most of the features they provide are available in one of the 8 that I recommend. Not in every one of them, right? But that they are available. And so if that's the case, if you have an easier time configuring it, if you have less performance problems, and if you don't have to keep going back and adjusting it every time the underlying product changes, if your developers can go in and make adjustments and introduce new features and they don't have to worry about it because the platform's stable, you're going to discover that those other 8 are a better fit for you. At least that's what I think. But again, these are my personal opinions, my own evaluation and assessment, and that doesn't stop you from figuring out what the right product is for you. But that answers the question as to why some of those plugins weren't in my top 8. Thanks.